Welcome everyone to Transform Scotland's second Moving the Vote event. This second event is with Carol Ford from the Scottish Liberal Democrats, and welcome also to Alistair Dalton, who will be chairing the event today. Before we get started, I am going to share our video call protocols with you. Shouldn't take very long, as I'm sure we're all quite familiar with these by now. But first thing, muting. Please make sure you stay on mute when you're not speaking. Ideally, if you are speaking, then you shouldn't be muted. But if once you are finished, make sure to mute yourself again. Second of all, we'd encourage you to use the chat function if there is any comment you'd like to make, or if there are any questions you'd like to ask, you can put those in the chat. If you have a question, you can add a Q in front of it. That helps us see which are the questions and pick up on them. Thirdly, having a bit of a tech, yeah, there we go. Alistair will likely be asking most of the questions directly, but he may also call on you to ask a question, in which case unmute yourself, introduce yourself before speaking, and then pass back to the chair once you've finished speaking. And finally, troubleshooting if your connection fails. Just give it a 30 seconds for the call to reboot itself, and if that doesn't work, just click on the original invite link again, and that should take you back to the call, and we'll admit you back in from the waiting room. And with that, I will pass over to Alistair to start the event properly.
Many thanks there, Marie. And as mentioned, I'm Alistair Dalton. I'm the transport correspondent of the Scotsman. So for the second in this series of Moving the Vote, it's the turn of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, who have previously made a significant contribution to shaping Scotland's transport, with 2 transport ministers in their coalition with Labour. Those have been things like reopening the Borders Railway, which they played a major part in, but also more controversially, approval of the M74 extension in Glasgow, which was against the recommendation of the Public Inquiry reporter. So I'm delighted to introduce, and also to meet, at least virtually for the first time, Carol Ford, who is the party's transport, infrastructure and connectivity spokesperson, a position to which she was appointed in November. Now, Carol is not an MSP, but she heads the party's Glasgow list candidates for May's Holyrood election, and she was previously its spokesperson on children and young people. Carol is a school teacher by profession, not only teaching maths, but also writing several textbooks on the subject, and perhaps my son will be reading one for his maths hires. She's also then went on to a series of posts in school management, latterly as head teacher of Kilmarnock Academy. And Carol also holds various positions on a host of professional bodies, including teaching and chartered accountancy. But most intriguingly, Carol is a self-confessed Eurovision Song Contest fan. Now, before I hand over to Carol to set out her stall on transport, as Marie mentioned, if you have a question for her, please put it in the chat box, but make sure you have a capital Q at the beginning so we can spot it. And then I'll be bringing in Transform Scotland's expert panel for their thoughts on Carol's answers. So I'd like to welcome Julianne Robertson, who's Transform Scotland's chair and also communications manager for Explore Dundee, the city's main bus operator, and she will cover buses and public transport. Secondly, welcome Paul Mackay, who's External Relations Manager at ScotRail, who will cover trains. Thirdly, welcome Suzanne Forup, who's coordinator of the Walk, Wheel, Cycle, Vote campaign, and also Head of Development Scotland for Cycling UK, and she'll cover those areas. And last but not least, Transform Scotland's director, Colin Howden, who will cover roads and infrastructure. So it's over to you, Carol, now. If you could speak for no more than 5 minutes to summarize your transport priorities, and then we'll go to questions. Thanks.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm just sorry that Alistair mentioned the Eurovision thing, just in case that puts anybody off. Okay, what I intend to do is just give you an overview of the 4 kind of main headings under which the Scottish Liberal Democrats are considering the issue of transport. The 4 areas that are at the forefront of our minds are the climate emergency and the contribution that transport makes to that, the passenger experience, which obviously influences behaviour, which is something we're trying to do, the economic impact of transport decisions, and the impact of those decisions on social equity. So I'm going to give you an overview of our thinking under those 4 headings. I have to say that the detail, some of the detail of our policy is actually not going to be released until the launch of our manifesto in April, but I will try to answer as well as I can any more detailed questions. So on climate change, the reduction in carbon emissions from transport has been disappointingly low. And so our emphasis is on getting people out of their cars and swapping their cars to electric vehicles if necessary. And there appears to be robust evidence that car drivers are more likely to switch to train travel than to bus. And so we think that means there has to be an emphasis on reopening railway lines. And I'm glad that it was mentioned that the Lib Dems have a track record in that, and also to move trains away from fossil fuels. For the electric vehicles, we think we need to have a major infrastructure project creating green jobs, as it were, to increase the number of charging points. Because if drivers don't have confidence about the ability to charge an electric vehicle, they're unlikely to swap. We also think there should be an onus on all new public service vehicles to be electric vehicles. Now, in relation to the passenger experience, passengers are paying to use transport systems, and they are therefore entitled to have a positive experience. But absolutely crucially, we're not going to entice people onto public transport if it's an unpleasant experience. So in short, we believe that we need to make public transport or active travel, if that's people's choice instead, but that needs to be the easy option, not the hair shirt option, or we won't get a lot of the public to make that change. So we're proposing regional transport partnerships to ensure that local transport routes and timetables suit the commuters. And in particular, looking at buses. Now buses were deregulated by Maggie Thatcher, and that situation has never been altered. So we believe that we need to get some sort of local control and accountability back onto the bus system. And we will be proposing a franchise system to achieve that. We also believe that for longer journeys that might involve buses, trains, and ferries, passengers require an easier system for booking and ticketing, and we would introduce a smart card approach to that to make it as easy as possible. We will also invest in cycle paths and walkways to encourage cycling and walking, but we also need to make it easy for people who are doing that to connect onto public transport. So regional decision making is necessary to do that. We want connections to be designed for people on bikes and walking, and not for them to be treated as some kind of afterthought or nuisance in the system. A simple thing like adding 200 yards to a walk from a bus stop or a station to a ferry terminal, that might be enough to put somebody off and think, well, I'll just take my car. The economic impact of transport links is critical, and we do need major upgrades on some roads. The A9 is the one that springs to mind, and also what I always think of, the rest and be thankful, but the A83. I feel that in general, Scotland doesn't celebrate its topography. Linking the Highlands and Islands to the Central Belt and beyond, that should be just a matter of course. It's just part of our life. Instead, we treat it as a problem to be solved. We need to celebrate it more. And if we take decisions that are taken about transport, they need to look at what that means to local communities. So the example I would give there is if we're looking at where we put air traffic controllers, then the fact that you remove an air traffic controller's job from a remote airport community, that has to be factored in. It's not just a question of what's the cheapest option. So in general, celebrating what Scotland actually has in terms of its topography. And the final issue that's affecting our thinking is this social equity. It's a serious problem in Scotland, and it looks like it's going to be worse after the pandemic. Access to transport actually impacts on educational and job opportunities. I live in Glasgow, and I'm aware that the suburban rail network in Glasgow actually funnels affluence along its tracks. You can see
Carol,
developing affluent communities. If I could just finish this quickly, it's just to say,
at the risk of interrupting a former head teacher.
I know. Well,
5 minutes.
if I could give one sentence,
seconds,
we think that transport isn't just to meet existing needs. It needs to be promoting future needs and actually promoting social equity. So sorry about that.
No, sorry for interrupting as well.
No, that's okay.
The first thing you mentioned was getting people out of cars, and you talked about electric vehicles. So the first question is from David Murray, who asks, would you acknowledge that electric cars per se are not the solution to creating a greener country? And what action would your party take to create a less car-dependent Scotland? And I know you've kind of mentioned
Okay, right. I mean, I would absolutely agree that electric cars are not the solution. They're just better than what we have now. And I mean, if you're actually looking at the carbon footprint of, creating building cars, my background is maths with a touch of physics, but I know that there are, even the materials that are used in the building of cars and so on. So no, I would absolutely agree that electric cars are not the solution, but it's better than what we have. I think what will promote moving away from cars absolutely is not only good transport links in and of themselves, but they need to connect with each other. And as I said, they need to connect with the people. If we're going to encourage people into active travel, and I think that's what we want to do, not just from the point of view of emissions, but also from the health point of view, because Scotland remains sadly still the sick man of Europe in relation to a lot of health statistics. So we want people to walk and cycle, but that needs to connect up to the transport system. So if you can manage to cycle somewhere rather than use any other form of transport, where do you park your bike when you get there? And where do you change possibly into work clothes if necessary? So all of these things have to be married up. And that's why we are so keen on the idea of regional partnerships, because it's only at the very local level. I'm going to a very simple example here. If you can get a train to Stranraer to get the boat across to Northern Ireland and then discover the boat, no, it doesn't go from Stranraer, it goes from Cairnryan. So if you've got your bike with you, you're now going to have to cycle to Cairnryan. If you're on foot, you're going to have to get a bus. And it's things like that, the connections between transport that are critical. And we believe it's only at the really local level that people have the knowledge and the expertise to decide things like, where do we put this bus stop so that someone will be willing to get the bus to this point and then connect on to something else? Because if there's a half mile walk in between, will they decide, stuff it, I'll just take my car? So yes, I absolutely agree about electric vehicles, but I do think it is about the connections between modes of transport as well as the modes themselves.
Now, you've mentioned cycling several times there. Yeah. Cycling, walking, wheeling, the active travel budget is at record levels, but it's still just a fraction of the amount spent on other modes.
Yes, yes.
Several people are asking about spending commitments. Sally Hinchcliffe, for instance, said, should you be spending a minimum of 10% of the transport budget on active travel? And Andrew Lindsay is asking, would you commit to at least 10% for active travel?
Well, as I said at the start, that's the kind of detail that I don't want to reveal at the moment, because it will be in our April manifesto. At the moment, my understanding is that the percentage is 2.6% on active travel, and I think that is ridiculously low. And I think so. I think you can be safe to say that we will be looking to increase that. I think it's also about. I mean, changing people's behaviour is not just about the actual strategies. It's about people's perceptions, and so we need to when we're making changes to things like cycleways and walkways, we need to make it such that it's easy for people and it's pleasant for people. Now, at the moment, during the pandemic, we've had a lot of very rushed projects put in to create cycleways, and that's great as it stands. But unfortunately, many of them are very unsightly because they've used, bits of plastic poles and concrete bollards and what have you. And I totally accept why that's been done, and that's great. But we now need to look at it, doing it in a much more structured manner that actually improves the environment and is more encouraging to people to actually think about cycling or walking. And I think the cycling particularly is the one where the connections are so important. I can cycle. I'm terrified of traffic, so I will not cycle on a road that's got traffic. Now, even where there are cycle lanes, where I might contemplate it, I consider myself a sort of normal member of the public in relation to this, rather than a cycling enthusiast. I can go in that cycle lane, but if that cycle lane disappears at a roundabout, I'm not going on my bike, because I've got to navigate that roundabout and there's no cycle lane. So it's the kind of joined up thinking that is going to make the change. But yes, in fundamental answer to the point, although I won't commit to figures here, yes, more money needs to go into this, definitely.
I've almost forgotten to bring in the expert panel, so I'll bring in Colin Howden in a moment about your answer on roads and electric vehicles. But first, if I could go to Suzanne Forup of Walk, Wheel, Cycle, Vote about what you thought of that last answer regarding cycling and other active travel spending.
It's good to hear Carol sounding as though she's moving in the right direction, but we all know the devil's in the detail, so we're looking forward to that policy commitment. I think we'd probably just like to point out that over 50% of car journeys are between 1 and 2 kilometres, which even a very perhaps non-avid cyclist could probably manage. So we're really interested in hearing about the move to electric vehicles, because really that was the first thing that you stated. Do you have any more commitments that you're going to make about cycling?
Oh, sorry. I think that the fact you're mentioning about the length of journeys, a journey as short as that, people can walk that, but people don't walk, and we need to encourage that. And obviously, from a background in education, that's something that schools can be involved in, is getting the message across that walking. And I once heard somebody describing type 2 diabetes as they should call it the not walking syndrome, because that's so heavily linked to that. So that's the situation. No, I'm only mentioning electric vehicles quickly because the carbon emissions from current vehicles are a serious issue, and it would be better to get people out of those cars if we can't get them out of cars in total. And I think that for people who are reluctant to use bikes, I think we've got to get the whole system quite far down the line before they're going to make that switch. For example, if you use your bike for part of a journey and a bus for part of a journey, can the bus take your bike? Can you get your bike in the bus? Now, if you look at countries where they are much further down the line than us in relation to this, countries like Germany or the Netherlands, their buses just take bikes. So you can do part of your journey by bike, part of it in a bus, no problem. And that's why I think we need to be looking at that kind of whole sort of holistic approach to how would you make a journey that avoided using a car, hopefully any kind of car. But if you can't avoid the car totally, then it would hopefully be an electric vehicle.
So you're committing to increasing the budget from where it is at the moment improving the infrastructure and making sure that there's active and sustainable transport integration across
That's
the
what we
board of
want,
Scotland.
and that's why we're talking about moving to a regional partnership approach, because it's only in those areas, with the expertise in those areas. I mean, people use this trendy phrase, lived experience, but I think it matters here, because somebody who makes a lot of cycle journeys in their own area knows what the things are that need to be fixed. Somebody who doesn't do that just doesn't have that level of insight. And so we want it to be more localized so that the correct solutions are in the correct places, rather than being made somewhere centrally and it's not really suited to a particular area or circumstance.
Okay, thanks for that, Carol. Sorry, I didn't bring in Colin earlier. Did you want to say something, Colin, about that first answer on electric vehicles and car use?
On the roads point, I could certainly make comments. Yeah, I think in the Transform Scotland view is that in no way is support for new trunk road building in any way compatible with a responsible attitude to tackling the climate emergency. For 30 years, we've had no reductions in emissions from transport. It's become the largest source of emissions. We're making zero progress. Scottish Government investment patterns are massively skewed in terms of new road building rather than the sorts of things that Suzanne's talking about. So I have to say, in the next Parliament, again, we're going to be putting the message out. If one is in support of new trunk road building, you are not taking action on the climate emergency. So
I don't think we're talking about building new roads as such, but what we're looking at is the basic connectivity of Scotland. We cannot overlook the fact that a lot of Scotland is pretty rural, and the people living in these communities actually need transport, and they need connectivity to the rest of the country and beyond that. And they're not, I mean, the active travel isn't really a runner if you're talking apart from, the sort of very keen cyclists, if you've got to go 50 or 100 miles on your bike, a lot of people are simply just not going to do it. I think the Infrastructure Commission has just come out with a report that really we need to maintain the roads we've got, because they are necessary, and for the connectivity, particularly to the Highlands and Islands, then I think that you do need to look at the trunk roads that already exist and keep them in a state that they provide the service that
we definitely need to be maintaining the existing infrastructure, and that's something that Transform Scotland has campaigned for. Where you are wrong there, however, is that most transport is very local. 2/3 of all transport is less than 5 miles, 40% is less than 2 miles in length. We need to be focusing on these short journeys because they are the sustainable modes of transport, and they are most journeys. Too much of transport discussion is focused around motorways and aviation and long distance travel. We need to focus on short journeys. That's how we get progress on reducing emissions in transport.
I agree with you. I mean, that's why I'm saying that we are looking at breaking this down to a more regional, local level, so that those short journeys are the easy journeys to make using active travel, or if not active travel, then public transport, not getting into your own vehicle. But it doesn't, the fact that we think that's really important and that's our starting point, it doesn't take away from the fact that you do have to look at the long distance routes as well and make sure that for economic reasons and social reasons that the outer, sorry, I've just had an update notice on my screen, that those connections exist for the people who live further north.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, as far as long distance routes, you mentioned, Carol, the A9 in your opening remarks. A number of people are highlighting the disparity between the spending on road schemes like dualling the A9 and also the A96 at a combined cost of at least £6 billion, and the relatively small amount spent or committed to upgrading the parallel Highland Main Line between Perth and Inverness. For instance, David Spaven saying that only about 57 million has been spent on that, and only about 450 million has been committed. Others are saying similar things. Nigel Bagshaw saying, how can dualling the A9 be in any way compatible with addressing the climate crisis? Sorry, I'm not seeing them all, but there are others who have pointed out that disparity. So should we be continuing with such major road schemes as the 896 and the A9?
I think there's a balance here, because you have to look at the kind of economic impact on areas. I mean, a lot of the traffic, for example, on the A9 is commercial traffic, and you know, lorries and so on, and that commercial traffic has to exist. It has to run, and I think for most people, the thing that they're balancing out is, if that traffic has to be there, you know, it is a safety issue. I mean, I hadn't travelled on the A9 in years, and I was on it just this summer and was fairly kind of horrified by A, how busy it was, and B, how dangerous it was in places. And I think that is a consideration. I mean, we are most definitely saying that that balance of funding should swing from trunk roads to active travel and public transport. But I cannot say that we shouldn't be maintaining longer distance connectivity in Scotland. I think we absolutely do need to do that.
But before I bring in Paul Mackay to comment, you said lorries and the importance of lorries and freight on the road. Isn't that the whole point of campaigners, is saying this will just make it even less competitive for rail freight? And that the A9, during the A9, will just encourage more freight to go by road?
I think the rail freight, I mean, we would be delighted if we could get more freight to go by rail. Part of the problem with the rail freight is that getting the goods to the station at one end and getting it away at the other end. And that's one of the reasons that we think that rail travel in general we need to be looking at where there are rail tracks that are lying defunct and actually use them, so that more commercial goods and so on will move by rail. But I think you have to, well, we are acknowledging that that's a longer term issue, something that we need to look at and improve. But in the meantime, there is an element of commercial traffic that is going to travel by road. We're simply acknowledging that that's the current situation, and it will take a bit of time to move it to what we hope will be the better solution.
Paul Mackay from ScotRail, any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, both from the train operating company perspective, we'd welcome any investment in the Highland Main Line, which makes it a more attractive prospect for customers through a better experience, as Carol has outlined, whether that's journey times or increased capacity. So that's for government to decide how they want to invest in that, but it'd certainly be welcome to try and improve the passenger experience. Just on the point about freight, colleagues in Network Rail have some pretty ambitious targets to improve or to increase the level of freight travelling by rail across Scotland, which is a good thing. It's going to help address this climate emergency, but it does we just have to be careful about how we balance that between having a freight train on the tracks and having a passenger train on the tracks. And I suppose where we are at the moment with COVID, we're unclear as to how passengers are going to return to the railway, once and hopefully when restrictions are eased. So it'll be interesting to see how that balance is struck between having increased freight against matching, the kind of new demands that customers might have as they return to the railway in the coming months and years.
Thanks for that. Want to move on to a very controversial subject that I can see coming back sooner or later, and that's charging for roads, road pricing or congestion charging. Now in Edinburgh, there was a referendum coming out for 20 years ago where the city residents rejected a scheme for Edinburgh. But a question from Andrea Habeshaw, apologies if I've mispronounced your name, saying that congestion in the city is as bad as ever, and will the Liberal Democrats support road pricing or workplace parking levy schemes as a measure to cut congestion and pollution?
Well, I think it's a sort of two-pronged attack on that. One is to make as I said at the start, our fundamental outlook is that doing the environmentally friendly thing should be the easy option. You're trying to change people's behaviour here, and the way to do that is to make it easy for them to change their behaviour. And so that to us, that's the priority. Get everything, the buses, the trains, in a position that people actually are happy to use them, and to make active travel simpler. The other way to do it is the stick. So the carrot bit is the bit that I've outlined, and the stick is the bit about forcing them to do it. And we haven't got a specific policy that covers the whole of Scotland, because the conditions are different in different places. And our view is that local areas need more autonomy. We need to get the power down to the local people to make these decisions. And if I take something like the bus system, now the air pollution we know is very bad, particularly in Glasgow, because of bus pollution, because all the buses go up and down the same routes in and out of the city. We need to stop that, and that's a town planning issue, and it's also a bus issue, controlling what routes the buses are actually on, which is why we're suggesting a franchise system. So I don't think that we're willing at this point to say we need this stick to be used unilaterally across Scotland. I think these are local decisions, and people have to look at the local economic impact of certain decisions, and that shouldn't be taken out of their hands.
I'm glad you mentioned buses, because this is a good opportunity to bring in the fourth expert panelist, Julianne Robertson, for her thoughts on what you've just said.
Yeah, directly in response to what you just said about the Glasgow buses travelling on this road, I would argue that it's actually primarily a congestion issue, because, for example, we have issues with pollution. We have two of the highest polluting streets in Scotland, in Dundee, where I am. But actually, buses make up 5% of the traffic on one of those roads, and cars are about 60% or so. So we are doing our bit. We're, reducing the emissions that our buses are putting into the atmosphere. Cars are currently not. They're doing so at a much slower rate. We are doing our bit, but it is a congestion issue. So that is, in fact, I would say primarily the issue that needs to be tackled there in terms of congestion. But also what you're saying about franchising, please don't make that the focus of your efforts on bus, because we can achieve what you want in partnership terms without franchising. It's happening already. In Dundee, for example, we're forming a sort of a Tayside alliance, a transport for Tayside, if you will, with local operators and with local authorities. And we're using that body to come up with a plan and to apply for bus partnership, bus priority funding. And that is going to be one of the key ways that we achieve much better bus services through bus priority and through tackling this sort of congestion issue that really does blight the network in parts. I think partnership is the way forward. No one body has the answer, and it certainly wouldn't be councils, I would argue. I have no idea where any council would conjure up the money to take over an entire bus service. And I think working in partnership is better, because yes, we need the local authorities, we need them to help with those infrastructure improvements. But yeah, franchising shouldn't be the focus. It's a waste of time, because it doesn't matter who owns the buses are still going to be sitting in those traffic queues in the middle of a city, surrounded by pollution and cars. That's the focus, that's the thing that we need to tackle, and the means to do that, I would argue, is already there. So I think as long as customers are the priority, and that the body, the alliance, is working together to try and tackle improvements, to tackle pollution and to tackle those issues of congestion, then you are already moving in the right direction.
Yeah, there are a couple of things there. I mean, we are, as I said, I think about 3 times, we are talking about regional partnerships in charge of transport, not just a council in a local area. I totally take your point in congestion, and I would suggest that one planning decisions that have been taken in Glasgow, again, if I use that as an example, is they have created what they call bus gates. And so many of the roads now in the centre of Glasgow, only buses, and I think taxis, can actually go down that road. Now that is a serious deterrent to taking your car into the city, because it's very difficult to actually now get across Glasgow by car, because at every turn you keep hitting a bus gate and then you have to do a big detour. So that's an example where I think a local planning decision can make quite a big difference. And if I think about the bus routes in Glasgow, they are still all funneled down the one road, and you can stand there and watch 12 buses coming at you at the one time, because they're all coming at the same way, and they're not being held up by congestion because cars aren't actually allowed on that bit of the street. So I think that we want local areas to have quite a bit of control about what's happening in their local area, but we also need that regional oversight to make sure that it's joined up. And that is the route that we would be looking at. In terms of the franchising, there is local councils can't take over buses. They can't. But if you have what's happening at the moment, this kind of free-for-all, bus operators want the routes that are already popular and make more money. And as I said at the start, there are areas of Scotland where the bus service is not good and there is no rail line, so there's no alternative. And if you're not in a state that you can either get on a bike or you're too far out for that, you're relying on a bus, and then you're at the mercy of the bus operators. And we actually don't think that that's a good way forward. We do want more control over that and more accountability to the local population, but also so that you can actually steer the development of areas that are currently economically relatively deprived. That contributes to them not going on the buses, and the bus operators don't put in the bus, and it's a vicious circle, and we want to break that vicious circle.
Can we move slightly on, staying with public transport, but there's a couple of linked questions about how we rebuild buses and other public transport as we come out of the pandemic. So Nigel Wunsch is asking, how do we get people back on public transport? And Andy Lanwern is saying there needs to be a plan to restore public transport and usage as we recover from COVID. And how would you enable that to happen so that it meets social needs as well as connections for active travel?
Well, I think, one of the ways, the Liberal Democrats certainly support the free travel for the under 22s. I think that's a good way to get the younger generation onto the buses or trains, public transport, and actually beginning to use public transport. I do think there's an element of people, when people feel safe, physically safe, I think a lot of people will return to public transport. And in the meantime, we need to be looking at how we can improve the experience for people. Getting that local control of where and when the buses actually run, and how do the trains meet people's needs, and how do they connect up with one another. This kind of overarching look at it, and bringing in the people who use the transport and asking them, what is it that puts you off? Why wouldn't you get on a bus or a train, and go from there? We are much more in favour of getting the information and then using carrots to get people back onto public transport. Local areas can push up parking fees where they don't want the cars to come. They can put in the bus gates, as I've described. There are local things that are very particular to those areas to get people back onto public transport. I am optimistic that that will happen to some extent anyway. I also think that you need to get the climate emergency to the front of people's minds. When something's at the front of people's minds, they tend to act on it. And so I think that aspect of transport needs to be hammered constantly, that every time you use your car, you are in fact contributing to the climate emergency. It's changing people's minds as well as actually giving them the means to avoid using their cars.
Julianne, would you have a brief response to that?
Yes, a brief one. I suppose I broadly, I guess, agree with what you're saying, Carol. I think people do need to feel safe, and in fact, hygiene and cleanliness is improved to such a point now on buses that actually they, in terms of the pandemic and the virus, certainly, you know, it's considered, the report saying it is considered one of the safest places to be during this pandemic, despite what some of the messaging is saying from other sources. So I think we do have some work to do on the messaging around that, and the fact that the government, not so much Scottish government, but some governments has been sort of promoting this message that you should avoid it, just stay away from it. So it's reversing that, I think, is going to be a big thing, and sort of encouraging that big behaviour change is probably one of the biggest things we'll have to overcome, fear, I think. Yeah, but in terms of asking people what they want, I think that is already being done. Transport Focus are doing excellent work at the moment on surveying people, passengers of all kinds, bus and rail, on how they feel during the pandemic, what they want going out of the pandemic, and that's really worth a read. Certainly, we as an operator are regularly reading those reports and using those to figure out what we offer then in the next few months to get people back on board.
And to address the other side of the coin as far as post-COVID, Ian McCall's interested to know, will you have proposals for reducing the need to travel in the first place, building on behaviour change and working practices that have become widespread during the pandemic?
I actually think that's going to be one of the biggest problems. I mean, I know there is this sort of general movement around the sort of 20-minute city or 20-minute living space, that you should be within a sort of 20-minute active travel of most of what you require, you know, shops and pharmacies and restaurants and any service that you might need, you should be able to get to it on foot or bike within 20 minutes. And I think that's a very attractive prospect. And there are a number of people who live in areas like that already. Our difficulty, I think, now is that because of COVID, that a lot of the kind of high street businesses they're currently closed, and some of them may not open. So I think that's going to be actually a harder thing to achieve, because so much of the local, it's smaller, more local businesses that have been more affected. The big supermarkets, they're actually doing well. They've actually increased their profits, but the smaller businesses have not. And I think that's something that we need to look at to actually partly create these services where people are. Now, that obviously falls into what our economic policies are. And one of these things is looking at strategies to promote the high street and get these local businesses back up and running where people live. It's also the case that it's a social equity issue as well, because if you look at what were the large council estates that are now, obviously, they're not run, well, certainly Glasgow, they're not run by the council, they're just social housing, but a lot of them are quite arid in terms of local facilities. So this is a longer term economic strategy, I think, that's required, so that people do not have to travel to get to the services that they require. And so while it's part of the transport issue, it's also, I think, a great deal to do with the economic arguments about how we structure Scottish cities and villages from now on.
And this time, Suzanne, if you'd like to contribute any comments on that one.
I think we'd perhaps all like to hear some more policies about exactly how you plan to enable some of these things. How will you actually enable 20-minute neighbourhoods? What are you going to put in place for that economic renewal? I think. Well,
I mean, these are some of our specific policies. They're to do with things like business rates and support for small businesses, and creating a climate in Scotland which actually is positive towards sort of entrepreneurship, particularly people, you know, setting up businesses or growing small businesses. And it's those policies that we have in our manifesto that are designed to try and build that in local areas where people actually are. As I say, being a citizen of Glasgow, I'm used to living in an area where there are some leafy suburbs that have got all that already. And then there are other areas which are remote from the city centre and also have very little amenity attached to their own areas. And that's where we need to start looking at the sort of economic side of it. So it's less of a specifically transport issue and more of a social and economic issue, I think.
Carol, I'd like to ask a question myself, completely different subject, but I feel very topical and very important in relation to recent events. It's to do with safety on transport, all types of transport, not just walking, and particularly for women. What are your thoughts on how that can be improved?
Well, obviously, being a woman, I'm very, very aware of this. And I know that a lot of women avoid public transport, particularly at night, because of concerns. I think it has to be built into the systems that we have in place. So you need well-lit streets so that people are less fearful of the dark and actually feel more comfortable that people will be deterred from doing anything in the first place. You need well-lit train stations and bus stations, and you actually need people on duty. You need to know that there are people actually around watching what is happening in these areas for women. I think that women tend, most women feel they're in a kind of, they're not the only vulnerable people, but quite frankly, when you look at the numbers, they're the most vulnerable people. Should you get in a taxi or should you get something like an Uber or something like that? And that's worrying as well, because you're then in a confined space with an individual that you don't really know anything about. So I think it's looking at the actual infrastructure around transport. Is it well lit, and is it under surveillance in the sense that people are there to help if necessary? And buses going from places, well-lit places to well-lit places, and not out in dark areas and people really concerned about getting off the bus. There is a limit to what transport can do in this regard. I mean, I've certainly been threatened, felt threatened and at risk in the Paris Underground and an Italian train. So this is a very difficult problem, but I certainly have been put off sometimes going into a dark station with nobody around and change my mind and come out. And so I think at the very least, that's what we need to be looking at.
On this occasion, could I ask perhaps in a moment, Julianne as a bus operator, but first Suzanne with your walking hat to give your thoughts.
I think probably just talking about women alone, I mean, you've mentioned other people that will be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Will Cycle Vote's very interested in how we make all our places more accessible. So perhaps I'd like to hear some views about how we put that accessibility at the heart of our streets, towns and communities. Do you have any views about low traffic neighbourhoods or place streets or other policies and provisions that will enable more people to be on the street, more people using public facilities, more people using public transport? Because I think we all know that busy places feel much safer for everyone, whether you're on foot or on a bike, as long as you manage to reduce the number of cars. And I think that's probably very important as well. Have you got any policies that will suppress the number of cars that we'll have on our streets, particularly in our local communities where those local journeys are done?
Yeah, I mean, that was the point that, what I was saying right at the start, that if we don't take a sort of holistic view of it, say getting people onto their bikes, then where there are gaps in the provision, that's the gap that puts somebody off. The minute that it's no longer safe, the minute that the bike lane has disappeared, that's it. I'm not going on my bike again. So yes, we need to do that. And I think that certainly in most of the cities of Scotland, the local councils are just gradually starting to both limit speeds and limit where people go. And I think we need to do more of that, particularly around schools. Schools are, as I say, as Alistair said, I was the secondary head teacher, and I have to say it was mayhem around my school every morning and every afternoon. And that put children off who might have walked because they had to weave through all the cars that were parking and so on. And again, you have to get into people's minds, because people were told repeatedly that they shouldn't do that, and they just carried on and did it. So yes, I think it has to be, we have to look at where people are, where they're wanting to go, and make the whole experience something that doesn't put them off getting in their car. And I think that's what's not happening at the moment. It's not joined up. And that's why we think this partnership approach is the way to go, to make sure that we actually create it's the whole experience that is improved for people, not just a bit of a lane here and there's a pedestrian road there, but actually how do you get to that pedestrian bit? You're on the roads, you're on the normal roads. So it's a more holistic approach we need to take.
Thank you. And over to Julianne for some thoughts from a bus operator's point of view about safety.
On safety, yeah. I think perhaps there's an onus on bus operators to work alongside local police services, officers, community wardens, things like that. We at Explore Dundee have a safer travel partnership, so we work very closely with them, and if there's signs of trouble, they increase their visibility on around the buses, that sort of thing, and also partnership working with the local authority means that we have an input into the infrastructure and the bus stops and the quality of those bus stops and where our passengers are going to wait whenever they have to wait for the bus at night or whatever. But that's just what we can do in terms of how the situation is. But obviously there's a whole wider reaching element of addressing how men are and how they're educated. But also I think one other thing which actually might make a difference in this is that if there are more women working in transport, they're the ones at the heart. They're making the decisions, they're viewing things through the eyes of the majority of their passengers, because the majority of bus passengers are women. So they can then influence the way that those things are planned and the way that the local authorities are acting on infrastructure and things like that. So that, I think, increasing the diversity within the industry would hopefully help and make a difference as well, I think.
Okay. I think we've got time for about one more question, and I'm going to hand over to road safety from Jim Dendrum, who's from Cycling UK Scotland. So what are your priorities, Carol, for improving road safety and reducing speeding? And that's obviously a key thing for encouraging more people to cycle.
Yes, well, I mean, I think it's a two-pronged approach. It's getting these cycleways in the first place and making sure they join up. I mean, I've said it takes my breath away that we put in a cycle lane and it stops at the most dangerous point. And I think we need to fix that. And we need to slow the traffic down. Now, the biggest cause of injury and death is speed. So we need to slow traffic down in areas where people are walking and cycling. And that's actually an easier thing to do than it is to create all the cycle paths, because that involves a great deal of infrastructure. But it's not difficult to slow traffic down. And I think there are many areas now, there's more and more areas, certainly in the cities, that's happening. And I think that's what should continue. We need to get the speed right down. And when you get the speed down, you actually put people off bringing their cars. So there's a kind of secondary benefit of that, because if you've got to move much more slowly, then you're less keen to take your car. And one of the things, I'll just make one comment, and that's about bus lanes. I think that we need more bus lanes, because we need to make buses much more attractive. We need to make it, as I said, the easy option to jump on the bus rather than getting your car. And I think we need to standardise the kind of access to bus lanes. I would just say cars don't go in bus lanes. I saw something recently about the number of motorists who've been fined for driving in bus lanes. And I think part of that is that the times vary from bus lane to bus lane. So people don't think, oh, I can drive in a bus lane because it's only 4 o'clock, but they happen to be in a bit where it kicks in an earlier time. So I would say that it's the infrastructure is to improve the bus lane system and just make cars not go into bus lanes so that everybody knows that's the way it is, and improve the cycleways so that they're continuous and not stopping and starting, and get the speed right down, which does have the double benefit of putting people off taking their car in the first place.
Thank you. And very short response to that from Colin Howden, please, because we're going to have to wrap up soon.
Yes, I think we would, Transform would agree with those things. I think, however, that we do also need to have a clear commitment to putting in place segregated cycle routes on main roads. I think that's the thing that's going to get cycle use up. So I think there needs to be a clear commitment on those things. So.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Well, we're just coming up to the hour, so we've run out of time for questions, but many thanks to those who submitted questions. I'm sorry there were quite a few that we didn't get through in time, although I hope we put some of them together. Thanks also to the expert panel, to Julianne, to Paul, to Suzanne and Colin, and most of all, thanks for subjecting yourself to questions from me and the others, Carol Ford. And just leaves me to hand back over to Marie. Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks, Alistair. Well, thanks everyone. I think this has been quite an interesting discussion. I think it's been clear both from the discussion and the comments that there are maybe some differences and with regard to the Scottish road building programme, but it's certainly reassuring and encouraging to see the commitment to improving trips in local neighbourhoods and the commitment to increasing funding for active travel. And I think the discussion around buses is certainly something that has triggered quite a few of comments as well. So I think that's probably a conversation that will be carried forward. So thank you very much, Carol, for being here and answering all of our questions. And thank you to everyone who attended for submitting those wide-ranging questions and for participating in this discussion. Thanks also to Alistair for chairing this event today, and of course also our expert panel. This was our second in a series of 5 events. Our next event will be on Friday, the 26th of March, at the same time with Sarah Boyack from the Scottish Labour Party. And this will then be followed by events with the Greens and the SNP in April. So we're hoping to see all of you, or at least most of you, there at those next events. They're all up on our website now and you can sign up. Yeah, thank you very much. And we hope to see you again soon at the next event.
Okay, thank you. Bye.